Hey, you guys, Matthew Stelzner here, and blessings to all of you, and welcome to the fall 2017 WTF is going on astrology forecast. And I know it's been super intense for all of us here on planet Earth in this last year, and I hope I can shed some light on what's happening in terms of what astrology has to offer. And also, we'll be working with the tarot a bit. I'm going to use the tarot to kind of help focus my intuition and draw forth whatever's meant to be said here. I've got a bunch of notes and I've got lots of things I'd like to say, but I don't know exactly what of all that is going to come out and in what form. I'm just trusting that using the consciousness technology of astrology and the consciousness technology of the tarot, both of which are incredibly helpful allies for going into the imagination to reflect on a symbolic language, and in that reflection, going into the intuitive place where we find meaning for our lives and guidance. And so I'm excited to dive in with you guys. I know it's been a while. I did some big videos at the beginning of the year on the Trump election, and I would really encourage you guys to check those out. They really go into depth about all of the major energies that are happening right now. And I'm not going to do quite as thorough exploration in this update. I'm just going to focus on what to me are the biggest and most helpful symbols to reflect on. And and so let me see here if there was something else I wanted to say at the outset. Yeah, I guess before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge that um, the intense energies of 2017 have really deeply impacted me, and I've been going through a pretty profound transformation this year, and these energies have been extremely impactful. And I wanted to take my time to see how I worked with them and what they meant for me before trying to give um, a sharing on that. And so I gave myself the time to just be in these archetypal waters, these intense energies that we're all living under. And from that experience, I now feel like I can share some of my own reflections on our situation. And so, um, having said all that, I want to introduce the tarot element, um, which is really new for me to bring this into a YouTube video. Um, the tarot came to me before astrology back in 1994. I really got into astrology a little later that year and then really deeply starting in 95. But tarot really was my first love of a divinatory system, an oracular system. And I worked with a particular deck, a modern deck called the Voyager deck, created by, I believe his name is James Wanless, and just totally love that deck. Um, but about 10 years later, I found the Osho Zen Tarot deck, which is now the primary deck that I work with, although I like to work with several different decks. And I will be bringing in some of the Osho cards here in our dialogue, as well as this other deck that I've found recently, which is called the Animal Spirit deck from the Wild Unknown. There was an original deck called the Wild Unknown that I haven't worked with much, and this is Kim Kranz's deck. Really great deck with animals and some mythic creatures and some insects, and it's a fun one. So we'll see what creature wants to come today to take us into our imaginations regarding what's happening in the world. And so Yeah, the tarot's been huge, and I have had it as more of a private practice until about 10 years ago. I started to integrate it into my astrology work, bringing it into my readings in a limited way, generally just bringing in one card to the beginning of an astrological consultation. But in the last couple of years, I feel like I've kind of come home to my more authentic self, and the authentic me just really wants to be shuffling tarot cards all the time. That's the truth of it. I love to shuffle cards. And so it helps me kind of find my center, and the cards themselves help focus my intuitive um, awareness and kind of guide my thoughts in a direction that I don't know where it's coming from exactly, but they seem to help me tap into some higher guidance. And so I thought I would bring them in here to this fall update and do a 5 or 6 card spread as we're talking about the astrology. We'll also kind of go back and forth and bring in a tarot card or one of these animal spirit cards. And the idea here is it's a kind of the way I see this spread that we'll do is a kind of group reading where the cards that I draw are relevant for me and for anyone who happens to find this video. I just trust in the exquisite capacity of the universe to bring perfect synchronistic patterning, and whoever happens to be watching this video, I'm sure these cards will be relevant for you. And I think what I'm going to do here is a kind of 5 card guidance spread or a question and answer spread, but I think it's more of a guidance spread where the first card is kind of revealing what you're seeking guidance about or what we're seeking guidance about. And this will be a question about how do we be with what's happening in the world right now? I think that's the question I want to bring to the cards. And so the first card will kind of deepen and clarify the question or what the guidance is that you're looking for. And then there's 4 more cards. One that's represents the background leading up to this moment that we're seeking guidance, and the third card represents the questioner, each of us in our own way. The card will reflect something about each of us and our role in this larger global situation that we're in. And the fourth card is the environment, friends, allies, guides that are supportive with regard to the question or the answer. Sometimes the environment card can indicate obstacles, blockages, challenging people, places, things that might be interfering with what you're seeking guidance about. And the fifth card it's the answer in a sense, but it's a summing up where each card is the question and the answer, and there's an overall gestalt. And so that's the plan. And perhaps let's start with the first card here, and just introducing this question, which will be exploring on a cosmic level with astrology. But I think the tarot is more personal. It's more like a friendship with your higher self, where astrology is kind of like a friendship with the gods themselves. It's more epic in a way. The tarot, in my experience, is more intimate, I guess. And so this is a question about how do we live with the situation in the world right now? What kinds of help and guidance can the cards bring us? And so I'm shuffling these cards, and whenever it feels like the right card, I will turn it over and it will represent what we're seeking guidance about. It'll deepen the question. This card seems to be coming out right here. Wow, there's a few there, but I think this one. Oh, wow, look at that. Politics. That's a pretty awesome card to represent the question about the intensity of the drama of the world right now. Sort of looks like Trump, doesn't it? With that snake and that false mask, the fake smile that pretends to care, when meanwhile, really all this politician is interested in is himself and filling his own needs and his own greed and desire and power impulses. So that's my first association with the card that represents our question. How do we deal with political assholes? That seems to be exactly what we're dealing with. How do we deal with these total assholes? I mean, what else can you call them? So that's the question. Of course, there's other ways you could reflect on this. There's other ways you could reflect on this. I'm just sitting with it here, as you can, kind of taking in this image and the complex, multidimensional meaning that might be here. Sometimes I get this card and I try to interpret it more in a positive way for myself. There's a way in which that smiling face is maybe helpful to be able to stay friendly and positive, even when there's some kind of dark, hidden rage and anger that might be there too. That's not super helpful to express. And so, yeah, I think this in some ways might represent a call to be friendly towards that which we judge and even hate. It reminds me of Ram Dass, who I've heard many times talk about how he puts pictures of politicians on his altar and prays for them. And as hard as that is to try to do, there's something profound about that impulse to send love and light and blessings even to those that you have the most judgment and anger towards. This, of course, is the approach of the Dalai Lama and other practitioners of nonviolence, is to stay in the heart, to stay in the heart chakra while facing evil, because that's what we're dealing with to some extent, right? The question of evil, is there evil in the world? The question of whether evil even exists is part of what we're dealing with. The darkness in the world that treats humans with such scorn and lack of caring or empathy. And of course, much more than that when it comes to the amount of warfare and oppression and racism and misogyny and genocide and all these things that are part of this human experience that we're dealing with. And we could summarize a lot of what I've just been reflecting on with the planetary archetype Pluto. And Pluto is by far the most relevant archetypal, astrological, planetary archetype for us to reflect on at this time. I think it's very helpful to engage with the meaning of Pluto and to go into our imagination and reflect on our own connection with what Pluto represents. And I want to name the first really big symbolic event that is occurring that I think in some ways is the easiest way of understanding what's happening right now. And I talked about this in my Trump videos. I went into some depth with it, but I'll just simply name it here. And it is the fact that the United States is going through what is called a Pluto return. Pluto takes 250 years to go around the solar system. And America, the United States, was born in 1776, July 4th. And that's almost 250 years that we've been in this great democratic experiment. And in some ways, it's the Pluto return of the modern democratic experiment for the whole world. And so the U.S. Pluto return obviously has implications for the whole global situation. And so this is an end of a whole cycle, the end of a whole planetary epoch, a 250-year-long epoch. And the specific time frame that we're dealing with is 2016. Was the first year that Pluto got within 10 degrees of the position it was in 1776. Okay, I'm back. So I was just trying to give you the range of the Pluto return. It gets within 10 degrees in 2016 and stays within that 10-degree range until 2028. So we're talking about a 12-year window. The big arc of this energy is about a 12-year period. It's more exact within 5 degrees from 2019 to 2025. And so that's more of a 6-year kind of core period. And sometimes at the beginning of a big Pluto descent, because Pluto represents the underworld amongst many other things, sometimes during a Pluto transit where there's a kind of descent into the underworld or an eruption of the underworld, you will see in the early phases that it's kind of like rumblings from the underworld. But then at a certain point, it just starts to erupt. And clearly, even though this got within range in 2016, early in the year, it became most obvious as the election really kicked in. And then, of course, once Trump was elected, we could really feel that sense of going down into the shadow, going down into the underworld to face that which is repressed, that which is denied, that which has trauma and pain, that which is being held down in the unconscious, whether that's our individual unconscious or the collective unconscious. And so sometimes at the beginning of a Pluto transit, there's this kind of rumbling, and then it totally erupts at a certain point. And the early phases, once that eruption happens, can be particularly intense, as there's a kind of adjustment to dealing with the energy. And I'd say that's kind of where we are right now. We're kind of really adjusting to this huge process that I really feel is going to be like about a decade-long process. I don't think this is going to just be solved by Trump being impeached or whatever. I think what has come up into our awareness, the incredible shadow sides of our history, from the Native American genocide to the oppression of so many different peoples, and the dominance of the elite corporate overlords that we're dealing with. All of this is an encounter with Pluto, and the process of engaging with the shadow, of going into the underworld, it requires a certain commitment and a willingness to surrender to something that is way bigger than any of us can control. We can participate in it, we can guide it in certain ways, but it's a bigger energy, it's a bigger process. Pluto is the forces of nature, the mass scale forces of nature that evolve and transform and destroy and renew. And that's what we're dealing with here. A massive end of a whole Pluto cycle, and then the beginning of a whole new cycle. And on a positive side, Pluto is about passion and life force and It has to do with empowerment and positive transformation and evolution. And I don't know about you guys, but as intense as this year has been, and at times overwhelmingly intense, and that's often an indicator that you're dealing with Pluto when it feels overwhelming or extreme. Pluto's about extremes. And clearly, we're dealing with an extreme moment in history that has the potential for incredible danger and destruction. That's what Pluto can feel like. And Stan Groff talks about Pluto as connected to the third stage of birth, biological birth, but also the third stage of a kind of universal death rebirth process. Stan Groff writes about this energy as related to the third stage of the perinatal process, as he calls it, the third stage of biological birth. He in his work, he divided the birth experience into four different stages that he found reported by his clients, who reported either actually reliving their biological birth or feeling like they were tapping into the energy of it and experiencing it in other ways. And this third stage of birth is once the cervix has opened and there's a kind of life and death struggle to be born. Prior to that, there's a sense of just kind of being stuck and trapped, which is very Saturnian. But then there's an opening and a struggle ensues. And there's a sense of incredibly intense energies and extremes of agony, and sometimes even ecstasy can be found in this stage. So it's a very complex energy, and so it's a very complex energy that has the potential for both this kind of extreme struggle energy, but part of that can feel like incredible life force energy that is kind of primal and empowering and passionate, but still with this sense of kind of extreme danger. And when it gets to the late stages of the third perinatal matrix, as Groff describes it, this is very close to the actual liberation of full delivery. It's the stage often where there's a kind of crowning, the baby's head starting to come out, but still there's not a sense from the baby's perspective that they're going to make it. It still feels like they could be destroyed. In fact, it gets to a kind of apocalyptic level. This is when people who are doing deep inner work and they tap into this stage of the birth process, they sometimes will feel like there's a nuclear war going on. And the fact that there is this kind of nuclear apocalyptic intense drama unfolding in the world with North Korea and China and the US and so forth, it is consistent with being in the very late stages of a birth process. And at that point, there's a sense of both feeling like you're being destroyed, but then very close to some kind of liberation. And this perfectly fits some of the astrological energy that we're working with. Beyond what I've been saying about the US Pluto return, we also have other indicators in the chart for now that also reflect a very strong Plutonic energy. And we can see this in several ways. We've been living under a Uranus-Pluto square since about 2008. And it lasts from about 2008 to 2020. And it's the same combination of two planets that were conjunct in the 1960s, from 1960 to about 1972. And this is the first time since then that Uranus and Pluto are in a dynamic relationship that's similar to what happened in the 60s, and we can see all the similarities happening in our era to the 60s. The renewed kind of civil rights demonstrations with the Black Lives Matter movement, and we can see it in a kind of new feminist revolution that's emerging, and all of the new movement towards LGBT rights and empowerment, and of course the legalization of gay marriage, and much more prominent acceptance of the transgender community. And this is where Pluto has a lot to do with empowerment and also with sexuality. And Uranus is freedom, revolution, change. And you put the two together and you get, like in the 60s, the sexual revolution, and now our own version of it that's more evolved, the next stage of the evolutionary process. And when you put these two energies together, they really fit the Stan Groff sense of the late third perinatal matrix, where it's both Pluto, which is the third matrix, and Uranus, which is more what the fourth perinatal matrix, the actual liberation. And when you put them together, you feel the sense of the intensity, but also the potential for a breakthrough. And this is where Pluto-Uranus time periods in history are often filled with tremendous breakthroughs and tremendous progress. It's the combination of rapid, mass-scale evolutionary transformation. And you see it when cultures go through growth spurts, rapid evolutionary transformations. Think, for example, of the difference between the 1950s and the 1970s. In the middle was the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and I think we'll see something similar as we get into the 2020s versus the 20-aughts. And so that's the Uranus-Pluto square that we have been living under. And there's so many other ways that it's relevant, where Uranus kind of liberates things into their full free potential. And in this case with Pluto, it's a kind of liberation of the id, a liberation of repressed shadow energies, a liberation of the will to power that Pluto also represents. All of the intense power struggles and power grabs and backroom manipulations and backstabbing and the Game of Thrones world that we're living in. And that is something that I've been reflecting on, is the way in which that television show, Game of Thrones, which is the most popular television show of all time in terms of the numbers of people all around the world that have been viewing it. And when you look at the intensity of the Game of Thrones storyline and all of the intense underworld shadow behaviors that are on display, and all of the impulse towards power, as well as a kind of freeing of these mass scale transformational powers, freeing of the dragon energy into the collective. The dragon symbolism, I think, is very relevant to our time right now, and I was thinking about it a lot during the recent eclipse, which of course is another one of the factors that we all can be reflecting on right now. The Great American Eclipse, which happened 2 weeks ago. We're now at the full moon after the new moon of the solar eclipse. And I'm sure most of you know that this is an incredibly rare event for the United States to have the full eclipse visible across the entire country. In every state it was visible, not totality, but every state, including Hawaii. This eclipse was visible, and it's the first time since 1918 that this has occurred. Oh, yes, that's the other factor, that It's the first time since 1918 that it's crossed the entire United States, but it's the first time since 1776 that the eclipse was exclusively visible from the United States territories. And so this is another synchronistic pattern. The Pluto return, that started in 1776, and this eclipse that is incredibly rare, and we haven't seen something like it since 1776. Clearly, if you go into your imagination there's a lot to reflect on, and you can see the eclipse as just an astronomical phenomenon, but it's also a phenomenon of the imagination. And I, as I'm sure many of you were doing a lot of ritual practice before, during, and after the eclipse, I was able to see it, not the totality, but a very significant partial eclipse where the sky did get dark, and it was a very profound experience. And during the eclipse, we were talking, my friend and I, and we got to talking about the different mythology surrounding eclipses, and there's so many different stories from different traditions to try to understand what an eclipse is. But I was reflecting on how, like in China, an eclipse is seen as a dragon eating the sun, and there's other stories of like demons and frogs and other creatures chasing or eating the sun. But it stood out to me that I was thinking especially about how in the Vedic system they talk about the dragon's head and the dragon's tail, the lunar nodes, and there's a sense that there's a dragon trying to swallow an eclipse, or excuse me, trying to swallow the sun, and it's literally a demon, I think, that Rahu is. But demons are pretty similar to dragons in terms of the energy that they embody. And so I was thinking about how this eclipse on a symbolic level is kind of like a fire-breathing dragon, or a few of them, like in Game of Thrones, flying across the United States and awakening us to the fiery, explosive depths of our collective underworld, and calling us to kind of wake up and face what's happening. And that's what I think we're going to be doing for the next 10 years, in my opinion, facing the collective shadow of the United States, but also on a global scale. And so I've been saying a lot here. It's not surprising to me, given the mass numbers of people that are engaged with Game of Thrones, that we might see a global political drama that really fits the mythology of that story. And it's very interesting to me that there's this Khaleesi character, this mother of dragons, and there's obvious symbolic resonance there with a kind of return of the powerful feminine, a return of the repressed, primal, powerful forces of nature that are filled with rage and with fierce animal aggression. It's interesting that George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, is born with a Mars-Pluto square. Obviously, very Plutonic story. It's actually Mars square Venus-Pluto, very tight alignment, and the Mars-Plutos really fits the fire-breathing dragons. And then you've got Venus, the Aphrodite feminine, that's riding the dragons, the force of love that is in the midst of that dragon drama. And so, yeah, I think there's a way in which we're all finding our inner Khaleesi, our inner dragons, and learning to ride them, learning to channel these very intense transformational energies that I feel another really helpful metaphor for understanding what's happening right now. I really feel that we are in a global Kundalini awakening. And for those of you that are familiar with what a Kundalini awakening is on an individual level, you'll know that it has something to do with very powerful energies that are kind of held down and blocked in the lower chakras and at the base of the spine. When those energies get activated and are trying to move up the chakra system, they will sometimes try to very forcefully break through the blockages, and in doing so, releasing tremendous energy and also catharsis and shadow energies are often freed up and cleared so that the energy can start to freely move up, ultimately through the heart chakra in a grounded, clear channel. And I think that's what's trying to happen. There's a kind of global Kundalini awakening that Mother Gaia is bringing to us, trying to bring us all into our heart chakras and above. And I do feel that that is our individual duty during this time, is to do whatever work is necessary to allow these profound ascension energies, these profound powerful forces of nature that can awaken the heart, to allow that process to happen so that we can live in our heart chakras and practice nonviolence during this time and embody what love and kindness is, so that it can be shown to those who have not found it. And so, having said that, let's draw another card after I sip some tea. So the second card represents the background leading up to this moment that we're living with, this political drama, this extreme political drama. What is the relevant background to this question that we're seeking guidance around? And let's see what card comes here. Ooh. So the background is represented by this card in the Osho deck, which is called stress. And it's a pretty interesting image of this kind of manic character that has all of these candles that he's juggling, and he's balanced on a balloon, and there's a little monkey that's about to pop the balloon. And this is an interesting representation of where we are right now collectively, I'd say. And it does kind of fit the background leading up to this moment. Certainly, it feels like another kind of bubble is bursting, and there is certainly a sense of being on the verge of crisis, and this kind of busy energy that restlessly is trying to stay above the potential crisis is, I think, very consistent with the denial and unconsciousness of our overlords, and also of ourselves, each of us, of course, how we all can kind of stay busy and above it all, and really not be aware of the potential seriousness of the situation when you're overstressed and not in contact with your higher self. So, question about politics, a background to lots of stress. Certainly that's what we're living with right now. There's a whole lot of stress that we're all feeling. The third card is supposed to represent the questioner, a relevant part of the questioner, and often like a helpful dimension of the questioner. And so this is a helpful dimension of me and a helpful dimension of you that can be a source of guidance for how do we deal with what's going on. And for this one, I'm going to draw one of these animal spirit cards. Oh, this one wants to come out. Whoa. Cobra. How about that? You're just talking about Kundalini, and Kundalini is represented by a cobra coiled at the base of the spine. I think it's kind of affirming and putting a line under what I was just saying about this collective Kundalini process that we're all engaged in. This collective ascension process that is trying to happen. I think the incredible paradox of our time is that as intense and overwhelming at times the situation is, in my experience, it has also been at times really liberating and evolutionary and transformational. I feel like this past year has been one of the most healing and empowering years of my life. And I imagine some of you are feeling the same and awakening to new possibilities and feeling like you're right on the edge of a new birth into a new world. That's what we're all dealing with, being right on the edge of a birth into a new universe of possibilities. And of course, the darkness draws forth the light as the light creates shadow. And both are true. We're shining a light on the shadow, but the shadow is also drawing forth that which is light in us to respond to the darkness of our times. And so I do feel that many of us are here right now to be a part of this transformation, to try to anchor light in this time of darkness and allow the Kundalini to rise up the chakras, both individually and collectively. And so this is quite a card representing us in this moment. And I'm sure there's lots of other reflections that you may have. You know, you want to go into your associations with snakes and cobras, and there's so many different potential symbolic meanings that one might find here. So think about how you're a cobra, or how you need to be a cobra in this time. Cobras are pretty intense. They're pretty kick-ass. You know, you don't mess with cobras. They'll strike back if you get too close. Now that could be a problem. And so this could also reveal a shadow dimension of each of us. It's interesting how cobras, they kind of are pretty chill until you piss them off. So how do you deal with your own cobra nature when somebody gets too close with you? That's when you got to be prepared with some nonviolent ways of dealing with that energy, the pissed off snake energy. So there's Cobra. And so I started to talk about the different Pluto alignments. We talked about Uranus, Pluto. We talked about the Pluto return, the United States Pluto return. But then we've also been living with Jupiter square Pluto and also opposite Uranus. This is the really rare energy beyond the Pluto return that's happening right now. To have both Uranus Pluto with Jupiter in a T-square, it's called, where you get Jupiter opposite Uranus, Jupiter square Pluto. I can show it over here. Here's the chart for now. Mars is setting here in San Francisco. You can see we've just been coming out of the full moon, and it's a full moon that sat right on Neptune and is activating the Saturn square Neptune, which I want to talk about in a few minutes here. That's another really big energy that is relevant. But right now I'm talking about Jupiter square Pluto. You can also see Jupiter tightly opposite Uranus here. Jupiter has just been in this very exact square with Pluto right since about October, November last year. It was coming in strong by November. And the way the retrograde motion worked with Jupiter this time is it really stayed very precise during this whole year. It's basically October, November 16 to September this year. And so this is the month that it's really kind of fading, moving out. However, it's the end of this really powerful visitation of Jupiter to this larger alignment that's been present since 2008. And we're at the late stages of it. It'll kind of last the rest of this year. The Jupiter-Pluto part of it, while it's fading by the end of September, this energy has just been saturating the collective, and so now it's got its own momentum. And even though the alignment will pass, we're going to be dealing with the aftermath of everything that this energy has corresponded to. And so Jupiter makes things bigger. It expands things and elevates and potentially grants success and sometimes good fortune and abundance, and it has something to do with higher moral principles, and it has a kind of global quality. It has a lot to do with international travel, international politics. And so if you put Jupiter together with Pluto, there's a range of potential meanings, and I would refer you to my Trump videos for a more detailed exploration. But it is the very principle of global high drama, political thriller energy, where Pluto is the struggle, the extreme energy, the intensity, the drama, and Jupiter makes it global, makes it epic, makes it over the top. And so it really is the combination of epic international high drama. Think of someone like Tom Cruise, who's born in, I believe, 1962 under Jupiter opposite Pluto, which that year the Cuban Missile Crisis happened under Jupiter opposite Pluto. It has this kind of epic intensity quality, and we can see similarities to the Cuban Missile Crisis and now what's happening in North Korea. It can be this kind of epic, over the top energy, and it's not easy to deal with, especially in a square. And if any of you are feeling like it's just too much, it's over the top, it's extreme, this is, I think, very much related to the Jupiter-Pluto square. It's a quality that totally could be there with the U.S. Pluto return, and so in some ways this kind of energy is likely to continue. But in another way, it'll be interesting to see how things unfold as Jupiter moves out of the square to Pluto in the next month or two, whether there's a kind of fading of the epic drama or, and I wouldn't really expect that this year, but maybe in the early months, January, February of next year, possibly. On the other hand, we're moving into another really profound alignment that comes in next spring, and that's the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which is a very rare event. The last time we had a Saturn-Pluto conjunction was 1981 to 1984, and over 30 years ago. And so that's a kind of deadly serious energy that we're moving into next year. And it's another symbol to be reflecting on. Saturn-Pluto is the combination of facing and working with the shadow and coming into a wise, mature, that's Saturn, relationship to one's personal and collective shadow material. And so that's what we're moving towards. The Saturn-Pluto it's going to be a serious energy for the next 3 years, and it's kind of parallel to this larger Pluto return process that we're going through. I'll have more to say about the Saturn-Pluto alignment in future videos. But coming back to the Jupiter square Pluto, it has a lot to do with a potential for like an expansion of all of the kind of shadow human impulses, like greed and envy and the impulse towards having control and power over others. And so there's a kind of there's a way in which Jupiter Pluto has so much to do with wealth and power and the elites that with their wealth and global dominance, in a sense, are able to wield incredible power in the world. And ultimately, Jupiter Pluto has a lot to do with the impulse towards empire. It starts on an individual level, the impulse to get up high, to achieve the heights of success and power in your own individual circles. But then it can go beyond that, the impulse towards real kind of global dominance. And so we're clearly seeing these individuals that are engaged in this epic political global drama that's unfolding. We're seeing mirrored back to us on an epic level what actually is also very much an individual struggle that's part of every human being's psycho-spiritual evolutionary journey. And so there's one way in which we can see everything that's going on as an opportunity to come back home to ourselves and see how we're participating in these energies in our own way, whether we're acting out the shadow impulses towards success and heights of achievement where you're becoming some kind of elite, and working with those impulses and trying to balance them with other energies. And so the other really big alignment that I mentioned that involves Jupiter is how Jupiter is also opposite Uranus. Uranus has been square Pluto. Right now it's a bit wider. It'll come back to be more precise early next year. But Jupiter has been going back and forth across both Pluto and Uranus since about October last year. And this overall alignment lasts at least through the end of October, but I think really we're talking about an energy that'll continue to have full momentum to the end of the year. And the Jupiter-Uranus part of it is very exciting, and it has its own shadow side. It has a kind of manic excitement to it that, combined with Pluto, really does fit a kind of manic greed that clearly has overtaken a certain segment of the world population. And so it definitely fits a lot of the shadow, the Jupiter-Uranus, in addition to the Jupiter-Pluto. However, there are many positive things about Jupiter-Uranus that are really worth affirming and reflecting on. This is the combination of rebirth and successful breakthroughs, and where Jupiter grants success and expansion and good fortune to the Uranus freedom and breakthrough energy. It has sometimes this quality of lucky breaks and big expansive changes. We're certainly dealing with really strong trickster energy. Uranus is the trickster, and that sense of unpredictability, the sense of erratic, sudden disruptions, and the sense that at any moment Trump could go in any direction. That's his own very strong natal Uranus on his sun and moon. But Jupiter-Uranus has so much potential for psychospiritual rebirth. And I want to encourage everyone who's watching this to think about these next 3 months as an opportunity to really flower. The crowning is moving into a full birth potential. When we have collective Jupiter-Uranus alignments, we see these big breakthroughs in history, whether it's the Berlin Wall coming down, or within months of that, Nelson Mandela being released from prison, the sense of the sudden, unexpected release of pressure and breakthrough to new possibilities. And so I imagine many of you have been feeling this very creative breakthrough energy building throughout this past year. And perhaps some of you can sense that you're right on the verge of a very liberating mass scale transformation and change. And so I think this is a very good time to leave some space for deep exploration, for deep self-exploration, inner work, and also an acknowledgement of all of the work that has led up to this point. There's a way in which at the end of the birthing process, it's like it just happens. Suddenly, unexpectedly, you're in a whole new universe. And so you want to be available to the possibility of that happening, even in the midst of all of the intensity and shadow and drama of our time, to be available to a possible rebirth. I think that Mother Gaia right now is wanting as many souls as possible to have psycho-spiritual rebirth so that they can show up in their best heart chakra potential to be a source of love and light in the world, which in my opinion is that if as many of us can learn to live in our hearts in this time, it will have a ripple effect in all of our lives with the people around us. And that's an exponential thing. You know, when your open heart affects another person's open heart, they pass it on to the next person. And I don't think we should underestimate the power of love and light in the universe at this time. I do feel that there are amazing sources of support, guidance, and love that are at work in the earth, on the earth, and around the earth at this time. And so I don't feel gloomy or pessimistic about this time, as intense as I think what we're going through is and will continue to be. I think in the midst of all of this, there's the potential for us to awaken to higher potential and to live from that potential. So, having said that, let's draw another card. This fourth card is meant to represent the environment. People, places, and things around each of us or in the world that are relevant to this question, that are relevant to what we're seeking guidance around. Again, it could be allies, helpful things in the environment. It could also be challenges and obstacles that might be getting in the way. So this is an interesting card in the Osho deck. It's called Isolation. Isolation. And you can see it's an image of a face that's kind of frozen, but that there's a kind of warming happening, and the face is being freed from the ice through tears, through a grieving process. I think that's a very helpful and interesting card to come, and it is very helpful to me to segue to the last big cosmic astrological energy that we're working with right now, and that's the Saturn square Neptune alignment. We've had Saturn square Neptune for the last 2 years fully, all of 15 and all of 16 were the strongest years. It came in starting somewhat in 14, got really strong in 15 and 16, and now 17, it's kind of like the collective is saturated with the waters of Saturn, Neptune, and it's fully done its thing. And now we're in the kind of last potent moment of the Saturn-Neptune initiation for each of us individually and on a collective level. And Saturn Neptune has brought many gifts and many challenges these last 2 to 3 years. And now is a time for reflecting on the gifts and challenges that Saturn Neptune has brought each of us. For beginning a kind of integration phase of all of the new wisdom and maturation that has come in these last years. Saturn has to do with wisdom and maturity and strength and discipline and humility, groundedness, the capacity to commit and be loyal. All of these things are Saturn, some of the best qualities of Saturn. Saturn can also block and frustrate and negate, bring challenges and obstacles, hardships. It can bring contractions. It has something to do with the existential hard realities of life. Buddha's first noble truth that life contains suffering. And then Neptune, of course, is complex, like all of the outer planet archetypes. Has many meanings, but it has a lot to do with spirituality, the divine, the sacred, the numinous, dreams and myth and mysticism, the esoteric, the paranormal, the mysteries of life, the subtle dimensions of life, the soul level realities of life. It is also the imagination, has to do with inspiration and our vision of life. Its shadow side has something to do with confusion, fogginess, escapism, numbing out. This overall alignment has so much to do with addiction and the epidemic of heroin and opiate addiction that has swept the United States in the last 2 years, as well as another more positive form of the Saturn-Neptune combination. When it's addiction, it's kind of being trapped, Saturn, in the Neptunian shadow side of escapism and numbing out. On a positive side, Saturn has to do with maturity with regard to drugs, alcohol, addiction. And we've seen in these last 2 or 3 years, I think, a major maturation in the collective vision of addiction, moving into new understandings of addiction that are beyond the old medical disease model, and looking more at the impact of society on the way in which society creates addiction, the way in which the traumas and the oppressions of society create addiction. And you can see this in the work of Gabor Mate, and you can see it in, let me pull this up here. Yes, 2 books I'll mention. One is called Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari, and the other, The Biology of Desire by Mark Lewis. These are 2 important new books that are looking at addiction from a new angle, I think, that really puts more of the burden on the collective political and societal ways that addiction is created. And so you see it there. You also see it in a more mature attitude to different sacred medicines, psychedelics and marijuana, with many states legalizing marijuana in the last few years, and a much more mature relationship to psychedelic medicine. The recent MAPS conference that had over 1,000, or maybe it was it 3,000? I can't remember how many people showed up at this MAPS conference, but it was amazing. And you could tell that the world has super matured since the 60s, and what happened with psychedelic medicines in the 60s, and with the likely legalization of MDMA for as a prescribed medication that could happen by 2020, and has just been granted breakthrough status as a potential medicine. this is positive evidence of the Saturn-Neptune. Saturn matures the vision. It has to do with spiritual maturation, and also it has to do with other challenges. The Saturn brings challenges and obstacles and hard realities. And so sometimes with Saturn-Neptune, you get things like the end of a dream, the loss of faith, paradise lost, with this tragic decision that Donald Trump has made to repeal DACA, and the new level of fear and anxiety that nearly 1 million dreamers must be dealing with right now. Neptune is the dreamers, and Saturn is the asshole that takes away their dreams. Sometimes with Saturn-Neptune, it can feel like you've lost faith in the potential to pursue your dreams. It's the loss of faith, but it's also faith found in the darkness, faith growing in the darkness. Saturn-Neptune has to do with faith overcoming fear. It has a lot to do with working with contractions of consciousness, depression, anxiety, melancholy, the blues. Learning to face those, work through them, get support around them, focus a light on these challenging states of consciousness, as our culture is right now, looking at depression, suicide, drug addiction, so prominent in our awareness right now, being worked with and maturing in these areas. So during Saturn-Neptune times, there's sometimes increased fear, increased anxiety. Sometimes you see it when there's a kind of dystopian, dark future that has arrived, as we've seen, associated with dystopian novels and films. It also, of course, has to do with what we're seeing right now as I'm recording this, all of the stories since the eclipse 2 weeks ago. It's amazing what has happened. The eclipse path across the United States, where it made landfall in Oregon, there's this huge forest fires happening up there, and in Washington and California now. The whole West Coast is on fire, and the smoke is filling the air, and ash is falling. This is a kind of toxic womb situation that you sometimes get with Saturn-Neptune. The toxic womb of what's happening in Texas, Louisiana, and the deadly waters and toxic chemicals that are a part of the flooding that's happening in different areas. And of course now this huge hurricane that's approaching Puerto Rico and Cuba and Florida. My prayers are with all the people in those areas right now. They're dealing with the Saturn-Neptune kind of contraction of consciousness. But on the other hand, it has to do with spiritual discipline, working hard with consciousness to overcome and move through these contracted states. And so you see it in a lot of like wise Buddhist teachers, like the Dalai Lama has it, and Pema Chodron and Thich Nhat Hanh. All these are kind of humble spiritual teachers that talk about working with dark states of consciousness, difficult states of consciousness, how to move through depression. Pema Chodron talks about her own depression, anxiety, and using Buddhist principles to face this. Using ancient wisdom. There's so much ancient wisdom that we can draw upon, whether it's from First Nations peoples or more modern religious systems. Saturn, Neptune has to do with spiritual wisdom and learning to develop your own and learning to live from that place. So these are some thoughts on our Saturn-Neptune energy right now. It definitely is a challenging one. I think it is likely to be less potent by the end of the year and probably feel like we're not so much in a kind of uh, dark film noir dystopian reality. I'm thinking of The Matrix came out under Saturn square Neptune, or the film, if you know, Dark City. These kind of darker films that, like in The Matrix, when there's that sense of, what's reality? What's the nature of reality? Is it real or not? The amount of like confusion that so many people are feeling right now is part of the Saturn Neptune energy. But what was I saying there? Oh, I know. I was saying that I think we're probably going to feel less of the intensity of this Saturn Neptune. This is a particularly strong moment of it for the next couple months. I'd say we're in the kind of final birth contraction of this initiation, and you can see that each of these planets here are going to go across the Saturn Neptune. We had the full moon on it. There's so many different energies lining up right now. We just finished Mercury retrograde. This card's looking me in the eye, so I guess this is the answer card. The Queen of Fire, the Queen of Wands just came. Amazing card. That's our answer card. This is supposed to be the summing up of our situation. I have to say a little bit about the previous card, and I'll say more about that. But what was I just saying? I was talking about all the different things that are lining up. The eclipse, we've been in Mercury retrograde, we've got the full moon happening right now, but then we got all these other energies that are, kind of in their last dramatic pushes. We're this next few months, we're moving out of the Jupiter being on the Uranus-Pluto, and we're moving out of the Saturn-Neptune. And, the intensity of the eclipse energy is often thought to be there for about 6 months after an eclipse. But certainly the couple months after an eclipse, you're more likely to see some obvious indicators of the energy. So, but you can see that all these trigger planets are going across the Saturn-Neptune. So the sun, the moon, Mars is coming onto it now, all lighting up the Neptune, the water element, the flooding, the hurricanes. Jupiter, Pluto, by the way, has a lot to do with these mass scale, epic forces of nature. Jupiter, Pluto is often there when you see these massive, whether it's hurricanes or earthquakes or tornadoes or whatever, where Pluto is the intense mass scale force of nature, but then Jupiter makes it even bigger on an epic scale. So that's there, but of course all the emphasis on Neptune just really fits. But it's also, you can see the sun's coming onto Saturn, and the moon is tightly square Saturn right now. Mars is coming onto the opposition to Neptune, which really, Mars makes things more aggressive and forceful, and the fact that it's going to be on Neptune and then Saturn this next month or so. It's beyond the next month. It's more like the next, I want to check that out actually. Let's just see what happens with Mars. So Mars stays on until, I don't know, let's say mid-October. So the next 6-7 weeks. And then after that, there's not such an activation of the Saturn-Neptune. I think by the time we get to December, probably there'll be a kind of lull in the storm. Who knows? There's another way in which the Jupiter-Uranus being so strong the next couple months, it could just bust things open in a really dramatic way where there's just super momentum from that point on, and maybe there won't be much of a pause in the drama. But the indicators seem to be a little less intense as we get to December, January, and then maybe they pick up a little bit after that. But that's for a future video. So coming back to these cards here, the isolation card, this card has a lot to do with being willing to feel your feelings and grieve, which is why I went to the Saturn-Neptune combination, because it has a lot to do with the grief process. That's one of the kind of contractions of consciousness, the heaviness of grieving and the different stages of the grief process that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross taught about. She's born with a Saturn-Neptune alignment. But when we learn to grieve, when we really are able to surrender to the depths of our feelings about whatever loss has occurred, and there's so many losses right now in the United States and around the world, the loss of so many precious, hard-fought battles and, well, you know what I'm saying. And the necessity of grieving that. We're not going to be able to do anything unless we really are willing to feel our feelings as deeply as possible. When we're able to do the work of the grieving process and feeling all the feelings that are there in a dark night like we're in right now, that's what gives us the power to then take action. Because when we're in contact with our deepest feelings, there is often a deeper knowing of what needs to be done. And so I think this card indicates that the collective is going through a kind of, well, maybe it indicates that there's a kind of frozen energy that's dominating the collective right now, and that does fit a lot of individuals that are frozen, that don't have their hearts open. And there's ways in which each of us have that to some degree. And I think the card is basically indicating that that frozenness can melt. It can melt. Our hearts can open. And this card is a representation of an open heart. The Queen of Fire in this card, in this deck, the Osho deck, called Sharing. And you can see this great, generous queen, goddess, in Thanksgiving type colors and carrying a light and fruit and a gold crown. It's very Jupiterian image. The royal energy is Jupiter. But this is an image of a generous, heart-centered, feminine energy that lives in all of us. And all of us can learn to live with abundance consciousness. So these two cards are obviously a big contrast. Politics and sharing. Do you want to be a greedy asshole, or do you want to be a generous goddess? That seems to be the choice. And I want to draw one more card. This will be an animal spirit ally. Whoops, look what popped out. Look at that. Peacock. It's saying this is Peacock coming to guide us. It's the final message for today. Follow the peacock, which of course is a symbol of rebirth. Amazing fan of colors. Just had a peacock feather here today. Let's bring that out. To me, this is affirming that we remember that even in this darkness, there is still the potential for rebirth and guidance from above and from those who are able to see from a more brilliant, multicolored perspective, encouraging us to find the peacock that lives in each of us, but also perhaps a caution of being, pretty as a peacock, proud as a peacock, showing off, maybe it's a caution about that, but I think generally when I see this blue peacock, this blue avian, I feel a lot of hope. So with that, I hope this has been helpful to any of you who've been watching. It's been really fun for me. This is the first time I've done this way. Got a lot of tech here. Waited till after Mercury retrograde to try to attempt this. And I don't know. I just this is how I love to work. And if you're interested, this is how I do individual readings. Check out my website at either my name, MatthewStelzner.com, or if you're in a hurry, you can write stelz.biz. And I hope to see some of you individually. Sending many blessings and prayers. Oh, and look, Phoenix. That's Pluto too. Phoenix rising. Take care, everybody.